The quest for knowledge is ongoing and will always be ongoing. Scientists will go wherever they can and dig deeper and deeper and deeper and opening new worlds. And opening new worlds for exploration. And that's the revolution.
This is the story of three chemists whose work has impacted our lives in revolutionary ways. While you may not recognize their names or know about their achievements, their innovations have changed your life and our world. They are responsible for much of what makes modern life modern. Arnold O. Beckman is a chemist who spearheaded the use of electronics in chemistry by creating new and powerful measuring instruments. Scientists and engineers use these electronic instruments to shape much of the material world in which we live.
All of these instruments that Dr. Beckman developed from the mid-1930s to about 1950 or 55, you see in various forms in hospitals and doctors' offices and in scientific laboratories, universities, everywhere you go. It's hard to go in a room in a laboratory, in a chemistry laboratory in any university and not see something that had its origins in an Arnold Beckman instrument.
George Rosenkranz is a chemist who led the effort to create one of the very first birth control pills, a type of hormone pill still used today. Widespread use of the birth control pill profoundly changed society, from gender equality to family planning, from changes in sexual behavior to population control.
We couldn't imagine the impact the pill had on the world. It changed social customs, morals. It gave a possibility of unheard, unexpected liberty.
Gordon Moore is a chemist who played a pivotal role in the rise of silicon electronics and the chemical printing technology for making microchips. These silicon microchips are the foundation for our digital age.
It's changed the way the world works. This is all because this powerful technology has allowed us to make more and more complex and high-performing circuits. They're the basis of everything electronic we have, unprecedented in anything in human history. Places that were completely isolated previously now are connected to the rest of the world. And of course, it's a technology that has enabled all of these internet applications that consume people today.
Although their three lives connect in surprising ways, each of these chemists carved a unique path through life, meeting challenges, facing setbacks, and pursuing innovation on their journey from chemistry student to visionary scientist. Along the way, they forever changed the world in which we live. These three chemists are scientists you must know. Electronic chemical instruments have extended our senses into the world of minuscule molecules, into the chemical domain. These instruments form our eyes for this world. They allow us to look closely at what materials are, how they behave, and how they are put together. Instruments are also our hands in this domain, allowing us to pull molecules apart and put entirely new materials together. At the start of this instrument revolution stood a crucial scientist, entrepreneur, Arnold O. Beckman.
Well, I'm probably a little biased, but I can think of a field no more fascinating than that of electronics, instrumentation, and automation. These fields offer the same sorts of frontiers which our forefathers had in the geographical frontiers.
The story of Arnold Beckman is a wholly American story about a very curious boy possessed with pluck and luck. A young man who embraced risk, adventure, and passion, and a grown man who shared his passion for science and invention with the world.
Oh, I think everybody's curious. Oh, yes, there's nothing more curious than a young child.
Arnold Orville Beckman was born on April 10, 1900 in Cullom, Illinois, a small farming town. His father worked as a blacksmith, a maker of everything from hand tools to horseshoes. Cullom in the 1900s had little to offer in terms of organized activities or entertainments for its children. For Arnold, the town became an education in invention. He developed a fascination with building things, using cast-offs from around town and his father's blacksmith shop. And when he wasn't tinkering, he was reading. When he was 9 years old, Arnold discovered a book and fell quickly under its spell.
Oh, I happened to find a book in the attic, Steele's 14 Weeks in Chemistry. It belonged to an aunt of mine, and that was printed in 1871, I think. At that time, chemistry was not a very involved science, and the book was mainly on how to carry out experiments using chemicals that are available around the house, salt and salt soda and things like that. So I got hooked on chemistry.
His dad helped him set up a little lab out in the shed where he could do experiments that he claimed were pretty easy to do and kind of liked it. He thought chemistry was really cool and he could do it.
Entrepreneurship came early for Arnold. In high school, he had not only his own dance band and a regular job playing piano for silent movies, but also started up his own chemistry consultancy. He was soon performing chemical tests for the local gas company. World War I was at its bloody heights when Arnold graduated from high school, and he immediately enlisted in the Marines. Just days after his arrival at the Brooklyn Navy Yard to ship out, the armistice was signed and the war ended. While stationed in Brooklyn, Arnold met Mabel Mentzer, a volunteer with the Red Cross. That chance meeting was the spark that started their life together. Beckman returned to Illinois, determined to become a chemist. In 4 short years, he earned a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Illinois in its leading chemistry department. He then set out for the West and a PhD in chemistry at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech.
I think that the attraction of the state of California as such played a role. I was young and curious to see what this fabled land was like.
At Caltech, Arnold started experiments combining chemistry with electrical measurements to plumb the newest scientific understandings of matter and working with some of the top chemists of the age. Finally, Arnold was at an institution that had the facilities and the teachers to fully challenge his incredible curiosity. He loved his studies, and the professors at Caltech admired the promising student. But something pulled Arnold away from his work. He could not forget Mabel Mentzer. Arnold made a choice. He took a leave from Caltech, headed back to Brooklyn to Mabel.
He was pining for Mabel, and he needed some money, so he managed to get a job at Bell Labs in New York so he could go back and make a little money and see Mabel. He got to Bell Labs, and they taught him at Bell Labs about vacuum tubes and electronics and what was going on in electronics in the 1920s.
At that time, Bell Labs was already a premier industrial laboratory for electronics and communications, the research center for the telephone giant AT&T. Specifically, Bell Labs led in the technology of the vacuum tube. As a fast switch and powerful amplifier, the vacuum tube was a breakthrough that started the modern era of electronics. Everything from long-distance phone calls to radio broadcasting owed its existence to the tube. And Arnold became steeped in vacuum tube electronics at Bell Labs. As his professional life took off, his personal life blossomed as well. On June 10, 1925, Arnold and Mabel were married. But Caltech still wanted Arnold, and its leading chemist urged him to return to finish his PhD.
And as I say, by that time I was getting nostalgia for the smell of the chemistry lab, and I agreed I did want to get my degree anyway.
In the fall of 1926, Arnold and Mabel set out for Pasadena and Caltech. 19 flat tires on their Model T Ford punctuated their 6-week cross-country trek. It was the first of many long roads the couple would travel together.
Oh, well, the story of the pill is a very complicated story. If you think that they say, and now we are going to invent a birth control pill, you are very wrong.
George Rosenkranz was born in the cosmopolitan European city of Budapest, Hungary, on August 20th, 1916. He was the only child of Bernard and Ethel Rosenkranz, a successful middle-class Hungarian couple who were fond of art, music, and theater. George attended the Rijksdeutsche School, which featured a curriculum that concentrated on modern languages and natural sciences. He was attracted to both subjects as potential career choices.
Well, it wasn't so easy. It wasn't an easy decision because I was very much interested, always very much interested in languages and in people. And one possibility for me was to be in the hotel industry, because languages was my other hobby. Ich bin Georg Rosenkranz, ich bin ein Chemiker. Soy Jorge Rosenkranz. Well, I am George Rosenkranz, de profession. Alors, écoutez, chez vous. I am, si vous voulez me connaître, je suis...
In the end, George decided to pursue a career in chemistry, largely because of the influence of a charismatic science teacher. However, his proficiency for languages would aid him at many important junctures throughout his life.
Famille magnifique.
George's parents wanted him to attend the Hungarian National University in Budapest, but he pestered them into allowing him to apply to the prestigious Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich.
I thought that would be a good stepping stone. But I didn't think of whatever came later to be, because I was a prophet.
George was accepted into the school of his dreams and traveled alone to Switzerland in the autumn of 1933. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology was an outstanding institution, attracting its fair share of brilliant scientists. The jewel in the crown was an organic chemistry course taught by future Nobel laureate Leopold Družicka. Družicka was a pioneer in the study of sex hormones, unlocking their structure and even synthesizing them. George admired Družicka and his work and very much wanted to study with him. In 1937, George became his doctoral student. Družicka was already working to synthesize the male sex hormone testosterone. In 1940, George received the Doctorate of Technical Sciences. That summer, Switzerland was surrounded by Axis powers. Hitler stood at the north and the east, and Mussolini to the south. Fear of invasion was very real. As a Hungarian Jew, George knew it was not safe for him to stay in Switzerland.
It was not easy because, strangely enough, the pressure was not on the students, but the pressure was on Družicka himself, because he was very protective with the Jews. So at one stage, we decided to leave.
George needed to leave Europe, but didn't have anywhere to go. When he was a student in Switzerland, George's social life included playing a game that would become another lifetime passion: contract bridge. In the course of his bridge playing, George made the acquaintance of the wife of the Ecuadorian consul. Through her, he inquired about passage to Ecuador, though he had no knowledge of the country, nor did he speak Spanish. The consul was happy to oblige, and George prepared to leave Switzerland. George's plan was simple: get to Spain, take the boat from Bilbao, dock in Cuba, and then take passage to Ecuador. To get to Spain, however, George needed to cross Nazi Germany and occupied France. The journey was fraught with danger. Everywhere there were police and Gestapo checkpoints. George finally made it across the Spanish mountains to the northern port of Bilbao, where he boarded a ship bound for Havana.
Do you think you're a brave person?
No, I did what I had to do. I think, as a matter of fact, that was a sort of a leitmotif in my whole life. My whole life. Do what you had to do.
My first interest in chemistry was developed when my neighbor got a chemistry set, and I found some of the interesting things you could do with it. I decided right then I wanted to be a chemist, though I didn't quite know what one did.
Gordon Moore was born in San Francisco in 1929. He grew up in a small coastal town 40 miles south where his father was the local sheriff. When Moore was 10, the family moved to busier Redwood City, only 25 miles south of San Francisco. It was there that Gordon was first introduced to chemistry through his neighbor's chemistry set.
In those days, you get some really neat chemicals in a chemistry set. I eventually built a home laboratory, which was significantly more elaborate, and I proceeded to make explosives on a small production basis. My standard yield of nitroglycerin was about 63 cc's, as I recall, which I turned into dynamite, for which I had to make mercury fulminate to detonate the dynamite. In those days, you could buy almost anything. You know, I would order all the chemicals I wanted, and they'd be delivered to me by freight. I could even order things like picric acid, which is the equivalent of TNT. All you have to do is dry it out and detonate it. And I did. I ordered them and dried it out and detonated it.
Gordon's love of chemistry carried him through his studies at Sequoia High School and on to San Jose State University, where he met another love, Betty Whitaker, in 1947. Betty and Gordon dated while Gordon attended the University of California at Berkeley, earning his degree in chemistry. Betty lived with her uncle in Berkeley during those years and worked at an office across the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. About a month before Gordon was set to leave Berkeley to continue his chemical education at Caltech as a PhD student, he asked Betty to marry him. They were married in an evening ceremony in San Jose on a Friday night. Their honeymoon was a drive down to Pasadena, where Gordon started at Caltech on the Monday. It was there the couple began their practice of taking in stray cats as their pets. Gordon obtained a doctorate in chemistry from Caltech in 1954.
I can't help but think how different the world is than when I graduated from here some 50 years ago. Then there were no computers on campus. In fact, there are only a few in the entire world. Can you imagine, though? No email, no internet. That's the life we had when we were here. In fact, for most of our calculations, we used an archaic device called a slide rule. How many of you have heard of a slide rule? Oh, okay. I see the history classes in here are still alive and well. I couldn't find a good technical job in California, so I had to go east for my first job out of school.
Newlyweds Arnold and Mabel Beckman finally arrived in Pasadena, California in 1926 after their arduous cross-country road trip. Arnold immediately resumed his graduate studies at Caltech.
What he did in his PhD, he built some really beautiful instruments, really beautiful detectors, and he made the first measurements of what we call quantum yields. Then he got this job at Caltech. They kept him on. He was invaluable. They made him a faculty member.
But soon, a new opportunity walked through his laboratory door. It had to do with the way chemists measure acidity, pH.
Now let's join our success story reporter, Ken Peters, as he chats with founder and president of Beckman Instruments, Dr. Arnold O. Beckman.
Well, Dr. Beckman, after seeing all of these amazing operations, I can't help but wonder how an organization like this ever got started.
Well, we got started very casually just 20 years ago, Ken. I was teaching chemistry at Caltech when an undergraduate friend of mine came in and told me his troubles.
Glenn Joseph, who he had been an undergraduate with at the University of Illinois, was now a chemist at Sunkist. And he had this problem in measuring the pH of byproducts from lemon juice, pectin and citric acid. Normal, inexpensive ways such as litmus paper wouldn't work.
So I built an electronic amplifier for him to help him out of his troubles. He came back in 2 or 3 months and wanted to know whether I wouldn't build him another one because someone else was always using the first one. I decided that was enough to start a business.
Arnold's solution to his friend's problem was to use powerful electronics to create a robust and widely useful instrument, the pH meter.
This tiny voltage is amplified and finally is read out on a meter, the scale of which is calibrated directly in terms of pH.
Integrated into a single portable instrument, Beckman's pH meter put the power to get rapid, accurate measurements of this fundamental chemical property into the hands of any user.
One thing led to another, and he and Mrs. Beckman went on a trip saying, let's go across the country and figure out how many of these instruments we might be able to sell if I could build them. And they went across the country and they said, well, I could probably sell about 300 or 400 of these instruments. And so I'm going to start making them. So he set up a little shop in Pasadena, which you can still go to. It's in the 3400 block of Colorado. There's a little spot there. And he set up a little shop there, and he started building instruments, and he started selling them. They started selling like hotcakes, and he couldn't build them fast enough.
Based on the popularity and success of his pH meter, Arnold founded National Technical Laboratories in 1935.
We were not very much business-oriented in our thinking. We were just, could we make the instrument and put it on the market? We were babes in the woods so far as the business world was concerned.
When I think of the discoveries that have been made in medicine and like that, and most of them use Beckman instruments, not only the pH meter, but say the most important one has probably been the spectrophotometer. That opened up a whole new era of being able to analyze organic materials.
Molecules and materials have chemical fingerprints. Specific materials absorb particular colors of light, or, more generally, particular wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. The pattern of this absorption is distinctive for any given material. It is the molecule's chemical fingerprint. For decades before Arnold Beckman, experts had painstakingly produced these fingerprints, capturing them on photographic plates. But in the 1930s, Arnold and others saw that new instruments could be made to find these fingerprints using electronics. They named these new electronic chemical instruments spectrophotometers.
Around 1940, 41, he put together this spectrophotometer, the Beckman DU, that just revolutionized chemistry and biology, because when people could make these measurements and figure out, there are these kinds of atomic units in this structure because they have certain characteristic light absorption. They absorb light in certain regions with certain intensities. They were falling all over themselves now to buy the Beckman DU and turn those knobs and figure out what these compounds they have, what were in their compounds. And there were a lot of really important compounds like vitamins and all kinds of medically important compounds, and people wanted to know what the units were in them and how to manipulate them. And Dr. Beckman Instruments, his DU told him that.
While aboard the ship that was carrying him towards an unknown future in South America, George Rosenkranz made the best of a trying situation. He socialized and learned some Spanish. 3 weeks later, the boat docked just outside Havana.
In Cuba, I was waiting for the boat to take me to Ecuador. where I had, of course, professorship waiting for me. But the boat never came. But what came was Pearl Harbor.
That really is my father. He never questioned it. He just charged ahead. One of the ways that he managed to be so successful is to be very, very objective of where he was and not to lament, oh, but it could have been so different, or I could have done this, or could have done that. No, very straightforward. This is what I have. How are we going to make this work the best way possible?
Though his plans to teach in Ecuador were thwarted, George made the best of an unexpected situation and looked around for work. The largest laboratory in Cuba at that time was Vieta Paciencia, owned by Dr. Angel Vieta. George convinced Vieta that he needed a staff chemist at his laboratory. Vieta, impressed with George's confidence and moxie, gave him a try.
I told Vieta, now that you have me here, tell me, what do you need most?
Vieta assigned George a difficult task. Sexually transmitted disease was rife in Cuba. At that time, there were few good treatments available. A competitor had developed an oil-soluble bismuth preparation. Vieta suggested that George design a similar treatment.
I said, can you make one? I said, children's play.
George got along well with Vieta and had great success at Vieta Paciencia, where he initiated many investigations and designed over a dozen pharmaceutical products. He had less success at first with another relationship that would come to mean the world to him.
The young lady in Havana. Yes, yes, indeed. Well, that's what it was. Cuba wasn't just yams and all-soluble bismuth preparation. In Cuba, I met the love of my life. I met Edith.
Edith Stein was an 18-year-old refugee from Austria. In 1938, Edith and her mother, Annie, left Vienna with their own harrowing story of escape from the Nazis. Like George, they landed in Havana and had to find a way to support themselves. Her industrious and clever mother opened a restaurant downtown in the business district. George patronized the restaurant. For him, it was love at first sight. Not so for Edith. George courted her with vigor. He asked her to marry him many times, but she was hesitant. One day, an inquiry arrived from Mexico City from a company called Syntex. Would George come to Mexico for an interview? He accepted the invitation and made his way to Mexico. When he arrived, George was quickly ushered in to see two of the company's founders, Emeric Somlo and Federico Lehmann. Syntex was founded in Mexico City by Solmo and Lehmann and chemist Russell Marker. Their goal was to synthesize sex hormones from diestrogen, a plant steroid found in the wild Mexican yam, Cabeza de Negro.
They said, we have a method here to make progesterone, but the oxidation requires a catalyst, and we can't make the catalyst. So could you make the catalyst? I said, of course.
The Syntex founders offered George the job of head chemist on the spot.
So I picked up the telephone and I said, Edith, I accept the job in Mexico. I'm going to Mexico. For the last time, are you going to marry me or not?
After finishing his PhD at Caltech, Gordon and his wife Betty moved east to Maryland, where he took a chemistry research position in the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins University, which was the U.S. Navy's proximity fuse and guided missile laboratory.
The U.S. Navy knew that it needed a better way to shoot down attacking planes, a problem that Axis scientists were also trying to solve. The breakthrough One of the biggest of the war, and one that would turn the tide of the entire conflict, was the variable timing, or VT fuse. This technological innovation came from the scientists and engineers of the newly formed Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory.
Gordon enjoyed his experiments, but in the end, he didn't find them rewarding enough. Gordon wanted his work to result in something practical and useful.
And one evening, I got a phone call, picked up the receiver, and the voice on the other end said,
"This is Shockley."
Gordon recognized the voice of William Shockley, the Nobel Prize-winning American physicist who had been key to the invention of the transistor, the next step in electronics from the vacuum tube. The phone call had consequences for the rest of Gordon's life. It would also change the lives of billions. As research director of Syntex, George Rosenkranz had a lab full of equipment, including an Arnold Beckman spectrophotometer, and no shortage of brilliant ideas to pursue. However, George was at a loss for qualified chemists, so he arranged for Syntex to partner with the National University of Mexico to create Mexico's first doctoral program in organic chemistry. At home, George and Edith became parents of 3 young Rosenkranz boys, Roberto, Gerardo, and Ricardo. At work, George was named CEO of Syntex and had the authority to mold the company into whatever he wanted it to be. Under his supervision, Syntex obtained a patent on a broad class of steroids, including prednisone and prednisolone. George wanted to create a vital research center that would rival the best in the world. He courted the brightest young scientists to help him achieve this goal.
I had an unlimited budget. I could employ the best, most promising young chemists who were trained in steroid chemistry.
George's promising young chemists included Carl Gerasi and Alex Zaffaroni.
We got all these young and enthusiastic people, and they wanted to do things. And we let them do things, and we let them mistakes, and we let them learn from their mistakes. And we made the mistake, of course. God knows all the mistakes we made in our lives. I can't count them on one hand.
And that's one of the things about my father. He was never shy to hire the biggest prima donna as long as they were brilliant and as long as they could tell my father what they thought about things. And it was on the table, it was fine.
Originally, it was a trio of Zaffaroni, Gerasi, and myself. You know, it was a very, very fruitful, very interesting collaboration because nobody could tell who started the idea, who said what. We were just so in tune that practically everybody could finish the sentence if somebody started.
George's dedication to research and his commitment to creating a spirit of creative combustion enabled Syntex to grow rapidly. The small company in Mexico City began to challenge the pharmaceutical giants of America and Europe. George and his colleagues were busy synthesizing compounds, working with the progesterone molecule to produce progestational agents, medicines to promote fertility, which appeared to offer the greatest likelihood of commercial return. In 1951, in less than 6 months of intensive, inspired, creative work, the Syntex team synthesized a new compound that would unexpectedly become central to the creation of the pill. In the United States, scientists were researching the fertility and contraceptive effects of various compounds. Syntex's new compound, norethindrone, became the favorite choice for inhibiting ovulation, for preventing rather than promoting fertility. In 1962, norethindrone received government approval for contraceptive use. From the moment it was first marketed, the pill was an enormous success. Within 10 years, there were some 25 different variants on the market.
business-wise, he was very savvy. He spoke all the languages. He could make all these deals. So that was a very significant piece because that allowed Syntex to expand around the world.
Of the first 4 contraceptive pills put on the market in the United States, 3 contained Syntex compounds and intermediates. In the 5 years following, the company's revenue grew from $7 million to $60 million. While George Rosenkranz and his colleagues were busy synthesizing the compounds that would build Syntex into an international company, Arnold O. Beckman and other instrument makers kept up the pace of innovation that made advances in laboratories all over the world possible. They crafted new spectrophotometers and other electronic chemical instruments that gave researchers expanded access to the molecular world.
But the fun, the harder thing is in the technical aspects. I know I have to have this thing be financially successful, but that's for the controller, not that to worry about. I'm concerned more about solving a technical problem, coming up with something that's useful for the advancement of science.
As his activities grew, Arnold expanded his company, eventually taking it public in the 1950s as Beckman Instruments.
Beckman Precision Instruments play a large part in America's tremendous chemical industry. In its shops and laboratories and among its people, we find a purpose that seems to typify the industrial and scientific spirit of America.
We were into a lot of different things. And historically, Dr. Beckman, because of his interest, that intellect and interest and sort of never losing that sort of boyish look into science and what does this mean or what does that mean. So we were into things like air pollution, we were into semiconductors, we were into liquid crystal displays when they first came out, gas displays. We were in the space program. When the big decision was made, probably in the late 60s and early 70s, to move from a basic scientific instrumentation company into clinical instrumentation, which was a real thrust of a growth of Beckman in the 70s, it all came from that early work being done using the technology from a pH meter on down. Really, it was an exciting time, it really was.
Arnold was extremely interested in the emerging world of electronic computers and industrial automation. In the mid-1950s, he formed a partnership with William Shockley. Together, they created the Shockley Semiconductor Laboratories, the first silicon electronics organization in what later became Silicon Valley. With Arnold Beckman's support, William Shockley began to assemble a team of brilliant specialists to work at Shockley Semiconductor Laboratories. Shockley wanted Gordon Moore to be the chemist on his team. Shockley was a confident, if immodest, scientist.
It has been my experience that everything, all of the more difficult inventions I've made, and I counted recently and I find I have some 85 issued patents, which makes me at least close to being in the major league on numbers. Most of these require many failures to accomplish. One must, it's my own experience that to do creative work, one must overextend oneself, one must count on falling on his face.
The kind of thing he was proposing to do was interesting. It was a brand new field. There wasn't much known in it at the time. I accepted the offer he made. It got me a job in Palo Alto, within 10 miles of where I grew up in Redwood City.
Gordon was happy to be back in the San Francisco Bay Area and part of an emerging new industry.
The electronics industry, particularly the semiconductor electronics industry, really is a chemical processing industry to a considerable extent. When I got into it, much of the chemistry wasn't understood, and a lot of the techniques had not yet been developed. So it was really an open field.
William Shockley proved to be a difficult manager, ultra-competitive and distrustful. These difficulties and objectives to the technical direction of the lab led Moore and a group of 7 other colleagues to leave Shockley and launch their own transistor company. With backing from technology buff Sherman Fairchild, the founder of several aviation and defense companies and the largest single shareholder of IBM, Moore and his colleagues started their new firm, Fairchild Semiconductor.
That was when we became entrepreneurs. For completely negative reasons, we set up what turned out to be one of the seminal companies in the development of Silicon Valley. That's why I consider myself an accidental entrepreneur.
Fairchild brought out the first NPN silicon mesa double diffuse transistor, the first PNP silicon mesa double diffuse transistor.
At Fairchild, Gordon and his colleagues helped create a new era of digital technologies that revolutionized the way the world worked. Their most important contribution was the creation of an integrated circuit commonly known as the microchip, or simply the chip. The thin slice of silicon with many transistors chemically printed into it to create an entire electrical circuit. Today, microchips have millions and even billions of transistors all interconnected to perform some useful function. Their work at Fairchild fueled the evolution of a remarkable location for high technology, Silicon Valley.
I was probably more directly involved in the creation of what we call Silicon Valley than I'd like to have been. We were, first of all, an example. We broke off from Shockley and set up Fairchild, which was not something that was done commonly prior to that. But after that happened, Fairchild turned out to be the mother company of many Fairchildren, several dozen, and I wouldn't be surprised if it went in the hundreds of companies can trace their formation back to Fairchild and its spin-offs. So we became the beginning of this phenomenon where a few engineers would run off with a new idea, find backing of venture capital, which really developed out here at about the same time, and set up a new company to exploit the new technology.
In 1965, Gordon was invited to write an article for Electronics magazine, predicting what would happen over the next 10 years in electronics technology. He was inspired by what he was experiencing at Fairchild Semiconductor, especially the ongoing development of silicon microchips. Gordon predicted that with improvements in the chemical printing process for manufacturing microchips, electronics would become far cheaper. More complex microchips would actually make electronics less expensive. He foresaw that complexity would dramatically rise to achieve these low costs.
And I looked at that, and it had almost doubled every year, a little noise in the curve. So I said, okay, in the next 10 years, it's going to continue to double every year. We're going to go from 60 components on a chip to 60,000 components on a chip. Pretty wild extrapolation. I wanted to get across, here's an idea where the technology is going to evolve rapidly and it's going to have a major impact on the cost of electronics. That was the main point I was trying to get across, that this was going to be the path to low-cost electronics.
Gordon predicted that to achieve low-cost electronics, the number of transistors placed on a chip would double every year.
Looking back from 1975, the 10 years, we may not have gotten 10 doublings, but we certainly got 9. So it'd been a reasonably good projection, and one of my colleagues dubbed this Moore's Law. I don't know exactly when.
In his article, Gordon saw that such great numbers of inexpensive transmitters would change and spread the use of electronics. In doing so, he accurately imagined much of the now familiar world of modern electronics.
Because it only made sense if there were applications that could consume these large volumes of low-cost electronics. So I had to talk about home computers, phased array radar, electronic watches, and a variety of other things that at the time didn't really exist.
Moore's Law has become the guiding principle for the semiconductor industry, steadily improving the manufacturing process delivering ever more powerful microchips and dramatically reducing the cost of digital electronics.
Now, the nice thing about Moore's Law is it gets quoted in almost everything that grows exponentially. I've gone on to say that if Al Gore invented the internet, I invented the exponential. It's amazing how often I run across a reference to Moore's Law. In fact, I Googled Moore's Law and I Googled Murphy's Law, and Moore beats Murphy by at least 2 to 1.
From the 1950s through the 1970s, Arnold championed the use of electronic chemical instrumentation to tackle one of the greatest challenges to society of the era: air pollution, namely smog. Smog threatened to choke the health and vitality of Southern California. In leadership roles in the business community, Arnold championed the use of new instruments to determine the causes of smog and to combat them.
And we built instruments to measure exactly what was in there, and there's nitrogen oxides, and we figured out how they were made, and it was also as ozone and things like that. And so instruments made all those measurements, and they quantified the amount of ozone and the amount of nitrous and nitrogen oxides, the amount of NOx, if you like, and figured all that out and figured out where it was coming from and figured out how you could mitigate it. You could mitigate it by making a catalytic converter, and so that when the gases come out hot, they get converted to inert types of materials that don't crud up the air. And the whole environmental thing was driven by instruments that made measurements of what was in the environment and what was polluting the environment and what we could do about it. So there's just a total connection with the instrumentation revolution, with our being able to improve the environment. And the environment in LA was improved by people using instruments.
California had been fertile ground for new ideas and new technologies pursued by Gordon Moore and Arnold Beckman. It would also become home to George Rosenkranz's new company, Syntex US. George loved Mexico, but his growing company needed to have a more reliable supply of research scientists and better access to the American market. In 1960, George moved Syntex's research to the US, wisely choosing fledgling Palo Alto, California, as the location for Syntex US. The choice of Palo Alto, now the cornerstone of Silicon Valley, was a visionary business move. Under George's leadership, Syntex grew into a more than $1 billion pharmaceutical enterprise.
No, I haven't got an MBA, and I am a strong believer that you have to learn hands-on. That is how, from chemist, from researcher, from entrepreneur, I became the person I am.
My father says, you know, I did what I had to do, but you still have to have the courage to do it. Being the leader, you know, you have to be the one that says, okay, I like your idea, I know your idea is not good, we're gonna do this. So leadership is being able to accomplish all these things with very strong groups of people and having the courage to make the decision to move forward and do what he says, I did what I had to do.
In 1981, Beckman Instruments merged with SmithKline Corporation, the huge pharmaceutical company. The new corporation became known as SmithKline Beckman. In the late 1980s, Beckman Instruments emerged as an independent company. Then in the late 1990s, it became Beckman Coulter, maintaining its leadership in diagnostics and life sciences instrumentation. With each of these transformations, Arnold's personal wealth grew tremendously.
Just happened that our company was successful, and I accumulated substantially more money than I needed to take care of my living expenses. And what are you going to do with it? I thought, here, this money was accumulated by selling instruments to scientists. let's give the money back to scientists. That's where it came from. They should have the first priority on it. And so the number one guideline has been that it should be for advanced research in the field of science, and especially in the bioscience-related fields.
Dr. Beckman had the very strong feeling that it was all technology and instrumentation driving science. That was it. He really wanted us to develop new technology, new instruments, new methods to drive science, and he wanted to do it. He wants to do it in a collaborative way across disciplines, to get engineers and physicists and chemists and biologists together to develop new methods and new instruments that would drive the individual scientists. He wanted us to get to the point where chemistry and biology had the big high-tech stuff that would drive the science the way astronomy had been driven by instruments.
He and Mabel had, very clear aspirations and discussions about where their money would go. But even though he was giving what at that time were mega gifts of $20 to $40 million, every time he turned around, his portfolio had replaced that money and had grown. So he was faced with a real dilemma. And then Mabel died in 1989, in June of 1989.
I think she was a sounding board. I think she was his best friend. She certainly brought a lot of stability, I think, to his life, because he was, you can imagine, this brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man going all over the country, but she was with him. They traveled across the country with their pH meter to determine, if there was any use for it. And, she was right there by his side. It's really a beautiful love story.
Arnold and Mabel had made plans to distribute their wealth together. With Mabel gone, Arnold faced some difficult choices about his philanthropy. He decided he could not responsibly give back his fortune to science, technology, and medicine in his lifetime. So he made the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation permanent to carry out their work into the future. Arnold Beckman died in 2004 at the age of 104.
Well, his legacy is really the instrumentation revolution. Somehow, he was just born with an incredible curiosity about how things work. I think he was always, from day one, trying to figure out how things worked and what he could build that was better. And even in his last days, he would be fiddling to build something at his house, some gadget he was building that he thought would work better than something somebody else had built that he just bought. He was a real tinker, and that was Dr. Beckman. He was just curious about everything. He wanted to know how everything worked.
Although the environment at Fairchild was a major improvement over working for Shockley, Gordon Moore and his fellow Fairchild co-founder Robert Noyce grew concerned about the direction of the company, and together they chose to strike out on their own, again. In 1968, Gordon and Noyce decided to spin off a new semiconductor company, which they called Intel. Noyce prompted the pair's departure, but it was Gordon who devised the business and technology strategy for Intel.
It's hard to pick out any single thing I'm most proud of. Perhaps the founding of Intel was my biggest success.
In 1971, Intel introduced the first commercial microprocessor, the brains of a whole computer on a single microchip. Since, Intel has been the industry leader in producing ever more powerful microprocessors.
It's been a phenomenal evolution of a technology. By making things smaller, everything gets better. The electronics get faster, they get much cheaper, the power consumption can go down, and the complexity of the systems that are possible goes up dramatically, as does the reliability.
The chemical printing technology for making microchips has also expanded into a variety of other fields, such as DNA sequencing, and has proven to be one of the most powerful technologies ever developed.
E.O. Wilson, the biologist at Harvard, had estimated the number of ants on Earth as something between 10 to the 16th and 10 to the 17th. 10 to the 16th is a lot of transistors and a lot of ants, but we've kept growing beyond that. The printing press, how many characters get printed in all the newspapers, magazines, books that are published a year? I tried to estimate that and found that was comparable to the number of transistors we were making.
Gordon has increasingly turned his attention to philanthropic pursuits, especially supporting scientific education and research and environmental conservation. In 2000, Gordon and his wife Betty established the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation.
We picked a couple of areas to focus on. One was the environment, another was scientific research. The environment because we had seen changes occur so rapidly during our lifetime. On the science end, I was trained as a scientist. Science interests me. We try to do things, though, that are as groundbreaking as we can find. Learning more about our world we think is important, not merely our world, but our universe. We support things like the development of the next generation astronomical telescope, where some of the real fundamental questions, like what is dark matter, what is dark energy, things that we don't begin to have a handle on yet, we hope we can do something that'll contribute to our understanding of the 97% of the universe that we don't know anything about at the moment.
Whether or not we realize it, every day of our lives is touched deeply by the work of these three chemists. Life without their contributions is nearly unimaginable. Offices functioning without computers, hospitals unable to perform quick diagnostics through lab work and instruments, women whose roles in society remained more circumscribed. Each of these innovators has enhanced our power to shape our future, all through instruments, chemistry, the power of materials, and enormous curiosity. Arnold O. Beckman, George Rosenkranz, and Gordon Moore are scientists you must know.
There's more about these scientists you must know online. To watch individual film biographies and learn more about their journeys in science, please visit the Chemical Heritage Foundation's webpage.
But what kept you going? What was the thing that kept you interested?
I kept learning more and more. It's exciting to learn new things. You get to do experiments, you get to learn things nobody else knows by doing research. That's a pretty powerful thing to have. I'm the only guy in the world that understands this tonight. Tomorrow morning I'll publish it.